Welcome to Cozy Tales. Tonight's cozy mystery is made for winding down, resting, and falling asleep. The story moves gently, with quiet clues and a calm ending. If a pet is curled up nearby, they can settle in too. Every Cozy Tales story is made with pets in mind, so you can safely leave it playing when you head out. Now, let's get comfortable. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Morning light had climbed high enough to reach the upper gallery, where it lay across the railing in long pale bars. Each bar of brightness touched the silver labels fixed to the nearby shelves and made them wink one after another when the angle changed. Below, the reading room kept to its usual hush. A page turned somewhere near the long tables, and a chair gave a faint wooden tick before going still again. Whenever someone shifted in a seat beneath the gallery, the dry scent of paper, paste, and old boards drifted upward in a light breath, as if the room had exhaled through its books. A neat stack of returned slips rested against Mabel's elbow while her other hand moved along the shelf. One fingertip traced the order from label to label, pausing where the eye already knew it would pause, at the tiny places where order had loosened by a fraction. A title sat slightly too far forward and was eased back into line with a small practice touch. Another leaned the width of a thumbnail away from its neighbors, and that one was nudged straight. The corrections were made without ceremony. The row settled. So did the space around it. From the gallery, the room below always looked as though it had already been written down somewhere in a careful hand. The long tables held their usual stillness. Chairs were tucked close. A pencil lay square to a blotter on one end table, left there with the sort of neatness that seemed to belong to the room itself rather than to any one reader. Near the wall, the map drawer cabinet stood where it always stood, broad and low and sensible, as much a part of the reading room's shape as the windows. The returned slips were shifted into a cleaner pile. Edges tapped lightly against the railing ledge until they met one another in a single straight line. A few titles passed under her eye and into memory at once. One did not. It belonged to a borrowing pattern that sat a little oddly against the week. Not impossible, not even especially strange, only enough to ask for a second look. The slip was checked again. The title remained itself. The memory of its usual rhythm remained too. Rather than begin by guessing why, her glance moved where records and arrangement ought to agree with one another. A hand smoothed the edge of the paper list she had been using, pressing it flush to the railing ledge so it would not curl in the light draft that moved through the upper level. The room below drew the eye again in one slow sweep. Table, chair, cabinet, window, table. The sweep stopped at the cabinet. Nothing there called out. Nothing had fallen over or broken the neat line of the room. Yet something near the map drawer cabinet interrupted the expected pattern below in a way that took a moment to name. Beside the cabinet, where only floor and shadow ought to have shown from above, there was a pale edge of paper visible from an angle where no paper should have been visible at all. She leaned slightly over the railing. The edge remained. It was not one of the ordinary records kept where records belonged. This was a list of titles, visible even from above by the regularity of its lines, written in the same hand all the way down and marked here and there with gold stars. The paper had ended up beside the map drawer cabinet, where no one could consult it easily and where no list belonged. Its wrongness came from that plain fact more than from any air of secrecy. A list was made to be read. This one had been left where reading it would require finding it by chance. The returned slips were gathered in one hand. The other lifted the list from the railing and set it atop them. Then the stairs took her down in a measured turn, the wood answering softly under each step. The reading room remained undisturbed beneath that movement. Floor level, the cabinet looked as it always did, broad drawers stacked one above another, each with its pull and label frame. The pale edge of the misplaced sheet showed beside one lower drawer, caught so narrowly that from the room itself it might easily have gone unnoticed. At the cabinet, the map drawer resisted when she tried it. The wood gave a soft drag against wood, the familiar sound of a drawer too broad to move without both hands and a little lift. One palm settled under the lip. The drawer came outward a fraction, then another. That was enough to show what had happened. One corner of the paper had slipped beneath the drawer and been trapped there. Dust had gathered under the cabinet in a thin gray line, the sort of line made by time and stillness and the slow settling of room-sized air. The trapped sheet did not match it. Its exposed surface was cleaner than it ought to have been if it had lain there long. The list came loose with care. One corner bore the slight fresh bend of having been pressed against the drawer edge. The page itself was pale, smooth in most places, and filled with titles written in a steady, tidy slant. Gold stars had been set beside some entries and not others. They caught the morning light in a muted way, less glitter than a change in surface, enough to draw the eye each time the sheet tilted. The stars were counted almost without intending to count them. Once the tally reached the end, her gaze went back and made the count again more slowly, this time noticing the spaces between them. They did not mark every title. They did not fall at any simple interval. One line would be starred, the next two left plain, then another starred farther down. The marks had been placed by selection. Decoration would have spread itself more evenly. The hand itself was easier to recognize than the purpose. The writing carried the same steady pressure from line to line, the same neat slant, repeated with a care that suggested copying from another source. There was no wavering of style as the list descended. The stars stood apart from that steadiness. Their gold was added after the writing, and for another reason. The sheet was turned a little toward the light from the windows. A thumb moved down the margin, touching only the edge, and stopped beside one title where the paper looked slightly disturbed. There, near the place where a gold star might have been, lay a faint rubbed patch. The surface was thinned and rough under the pad of the thumb, as if something had once been fixed there and then removed. The neighboring titles still held their stars. This line did not. Her eyes moved back over the starred entries, this time taking the first letter of each one in order down the sheet. One initial, then the next, then another. The sequence gathered itself with an odd insistence. It was too pointed to dismiss as coincidence, yet it did not become a full message. It approached one and then stopped, breaking off before plainness arrived. A title might be missing. A star might have been taken away from the wrong place or from the right one. The list was raised closer. Near the bottom, one title had been written over a second time. The same hand had made both passes, but the second line was darker, pressed more firmly into the paper than the others around it. The letters looked as though they had been retraced after the page was already complete. There was no obvious mistake in the title itself. No misspelling waited there to justify correction. The emphasis sat on the line without explanation, and because it lacked explanation, it drew more attention than any ordinary error would have done. A little farther along the margin, another irregularity appeared. Beside one starred title, there stood a pair of short strokes. No word attached to them, no number, no catalog note to account for their presence. They were set close together like a private tally. Nothing else on the page used the margin in that way. The mark had the look of something made for a reader who needed no explanation. The sheet remained in her hands while the room below and around it continued with its quiet business of existing. Window light on the floorboards, the patient cabinet, the dry old smell of paper from the shelves. The clues on the page did not ask to be solved all at once. They asked to be looked at properly. The rubbed patch came first because it changed the page most by what it withheld. Tilted flat, the place showed only a pale scuff. Tilted toward the window, it revealed a slight difference in sheen where the paper fibers had been disturbed. A thumb passed over it again and met a texture unlike the rest of the sheet. Rougher there, a little thinned, as though the top layer had been worried away by a fingernail or the edge of something lifted off too quickly. The neighboring stars were small and neatly set, each one a bright point against the plain writing. This blank place sat in relation to them the way a missing button sits among fastened ones. She traced the line without touching the writing itself, following the title from its first letter to its last, and then back to the rubbed place beside it. If a mark had once been there, it had belonged to the same system as the others. Yet the patch was smaller than expected, narrower somehow in its disturbance than the stars that remained. That did not become a conclusion. It remained simply another thing to hold in mind. The line had once been selected. Now it was not. Whether the removal had changed the meaning of the list or protected, it was still impossible to say. The first letters of the marked titles asked for another reading. The page was lowered to the cabinet top, and one finger hovered over each starred line in turn, moving downward. The initials assembled themselves slowly. There was a temptation to hurry them into a word, the way one hurries cloud shapes into familiar animals. But the letters resisted haste. They suggested. They leaned. They nearly declared themselves. Then the sequence stopped short. A fragment remained where a sentence might have been. Looking back to the rubbed patch, it became difficult not to imagine that the absent mark belonged among them, and that its title's initial might bridge the gap between suggestive and plain. The possibility changed the shape of the page without settling it. If the stars isolated a message, then the writing had been arranged for someone who knew to read downward. If the stars isolated a category, then the letters might be accidental and the page meant to be used in some more practical way. Both thoughts could sit side by side for the moment. The list allowed them room. Attention drifted to the darker line near the bottom. Up close, the rewriting showed itself more clearly. The second pass through the title had deepened the ink's appearance, not by changing its color, but by pressing the fibers below it. The letters had a slight emboss to them, the sort that can be felt more than seen when a fingertip skims the reverse side of a page. She turned the sheet and found it there, a more pronounced ridge beneath that one title than beneath the others. The hand had gone over the words with intention, yet no visible correction justified the effort. The title was legible in both passes. Why strengthen what could already be read? Why only there? The pair of short strokes in the margin looked simpler at a glance than they did after a minute. They were not decorative. They lacked the flourish of the stars and the regularity of catalog symbols. Their spacing was close, practical, almost brisk. A person might make such a mark while sorting a stack, or while trying to remember that one line belonged to some separate purpose. Because it appeared only once, the little notation refused to explain itself by repetition. The list was held farther away, then nearer, then angled once more. Its order remained tidy. Its disturbances remained few. That made each one weightier. The stars selected certain titles. One selected title had lost its star. One line had been pressed over again. One margin mark stood alone. The first letters of the selected titles assembled into a fragment that seemed to want one more piece. Footsteps rose on the stair with a soft, measured sound, accompanied by the rustle of paper carried in a pocket. Along with it came cooler air, touched faintly by the street-facing side of the building. Silas reached the gallery level and paused at the railing before speaking, one hand resting there lightly. Folded handbill showed from his pocket, its edge worn a little from being tucked away and taken out again. "What have you found?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough that the reading room below remained nothing more than itself. The page was lifted slightly in answer. He came nearer, and his eye went at once to the gold stars rather than to the titles. "That is interesting," he said after a moment. "People add flourishes for many reasons. The added marks usually tell more about the second hand than the first. The list was angled toward the light between them. Beside the map drawer cabinet, they stood with the sheet held carefully from opposite edges, one set of fingers preserving its order and keeping it flat, the other adjusting the tilt so the surface could speak. The contrast fitted them without needing to be named aloud. Her attention followed sequence, consistency, placement. His watched for emphasis, display, the sort of thing made to catch a particular eye. "It was caught under the drawer," she said. "Only one corner. The paper is too clean to have been there long." His glance flicked to the cabinet, then back to the page. "And the stars?" "Chosen, not decorative. One seems to have been removed." That brought his face a little closer to the sheet. The handbill in his pocket rustled faintly as he leaned. "May I?" The page shifted between them, so the rub patch sat in the light. For a while they said very little. The room below supplied its own small sounds. A page turning, a distant footstep, the mild settling creak of old wood. Against that quiet, the investigation began to gather itself more clearly. The starred titles were checked against the unstarred ones in order. One finger moved down the selected entries, while the other traced the plain lines left between them. Shelf placement offered no immediate pattern. The marked books were not grouped by neighboring call number or by any easy sequence of arrangement. Subject began to speak where order did not. The starred titles suggested movement, journeys, routes, distances, arrivals. One implied crossing, another hinted at roads or passages. The unstarred titles did not share that thread. Silas murmured one of the selected titles under his breath, then another. "These travel," he said softly. "They do," she answered, "though not all in the same way. Enough of the same way." The distinction mattered. A list made from shelf order could have gathered any number of unrelated books. A list made by subject had been chosen by thought. The stars narrowed that thought further. The marked entries were being asked to stand together. The rubbed patch was brought under the window light, where the morning had shifted into a broader brightness. Held there, the damaged spot offered more than roughness. Around the place where the missing mark had been, a shallow circular impression appeared, so faint that it vanished when the paper flattened and returned when it tilted. It was smaller than the gold stars still on the sheet. The ring sat around the rubbed patch like the memory of pressure. He narrowed his eyes at it. There was something there long enough to leave a shape. A mark? Perhaps. Something attached, then lifted. The page changed hands so the light caught from another angle. The circle remained. It did not match the size of the stars that stayed behind. It suggested that whatever had been removed had once occupied the place of a star in the pattern, yet had not been exactly the same as the others, or had been fixed in some slightly different way. The paper had been handled after the removal, too. The disturbed fibers and the ring did not look old enough to have settled into one another. The line had been chosen, then altered. The darker rewritten title invited a slower comparison. They examined the pressure of the ordinary lines, then returned to the one near the bottom. The hand was the same. The spacing was the same. Yet the second pass through the letters revealed something the first glance had missed. The emphasis did not fall evenly across the whole title. The final word bore the most pressure, and just before it there was a trace of hesitation, a tiny thickening where the pen had paused before continuing. It was the sort of pause made when restoring clarity to something nearly obscured. "It doesn't read like correction," she said. "No," he replied. "It reads like rescue." If the line had been nearly hidden and then rewritten, the second pass had not existed to fix a mistake. It had existed so that one title could still be plainly read. What had nearly obscured it? A finger, another sheet laid over it, a smear. The page did not say yet. Still, the line's emphasis had shifted from mysterious insistence to practical preservation. When they came to the pair of short strokes in the margin, Silas made a small absent gesture with two fingers drawing together, as if his hand had recognized something before his thoughts had named it. The folded handbill rustled again when he shifted his weight. "I have seen marks like that," he said after a moment. "Not exactly this one. The feeling of it, perhaps, on tickets, on handbills sorted in haste, a practical sign." He looked again at the little notation. Something to set aside from a larger stack. Set aside for what? That I cannot say. The answer was modest and useful both. The mark did not become less uncertain for being familiar in spirit. It became more grounded. A private tally had seemed possible before. Now another possibility stood beside it. A sorting sign, made quickly by someone handling many papers and needing one item kept apart. The first letters of the starred titles were read downward again. This time the missing mark was treated as a gap rather than as a flaw. One title was included in thought where its star no longer remained. The initials shifted under that allowance. The fragment changed shape. It no longer strained toward a secret sentence. Instead, it leaned toward direction, as if it wanted to indicate where something should go or how something should move. Incomplete. Yes. Obscure. Still. Yet less like a code invented for cleverness and more like an instruction interrupted by one absent piece. She read the letters softly, pausing at the gap. He listened, then repeated only the shape of it, not the exact sequence, as though testing what kind of phrase it wished to become. The page offered no final answer. It offered a firmer question. The cabinet itself asked to be consulted. Before any dramatic thought could take hold, its top was checked for ordinary reasons. Dust lay there in a thin, even veil, visible only when the light struck across it. A finger did not touch it. Looking was enough. Near the edge there showed one cleaner arc, slight and curved, where the dust had been disturbed. The shape was no wider than the list. It suggested that the paper had rested there briefly before slipping or being pushed toward the drawer. "Written elsewhere," she said. He nodded. "Set here for a moment, then lost." Or hidden in haste. Below the drawer, the dust line and the clean paper argued together more clearly now. The sheet had not lived there. It had arrived there recently, and likely with the expectation of being retrieved before long. Mabel held that difference as she might hold a record entry. Dust beneath, fresh paper above, one brief bend at the corner, no travel folds through the body of the page. The facts did not force motive. They narrowed time. The handbill in Silas's pocket gave another soft rustle when he turned, and the sound drew his attention to the page's condition in a new way. He withdrew the folded paper halfway, enough to show the network of creases gathered by carrying. Then he tucked it back. Paper that travels acquires habits, he said. This one has almost none. The list was examined for them. There were no crossfolds, no repeated bend from pocketing, no softened center from being opened and closed. Only the one fresh bend near the corner where it had been trapped. That matched being tucked quickly against a flat surface. It did not match being carried from place to place over any length of time. So it was near at hand, she said, and used near where it was found. Their attention returned to the starred titles themselves. Spoken softly in sequence, they began to gather more than initials. One by one, the selected words carried movement with them. Roads, distances, arrivals, crossings. Then one title among them landed with more practical weight than the others. Parcels, he said. The word remained between them. It did not answer who had written the list. It did not explain why the sheet had been hidden, or nearly hidden, under the map drawer. Yet it gave the pattern somewhere to lean. Movement and routes could belong to stories, to maps, to travel in the broadest sense. Parcels belonged to handling, to things wrapped, left, collected, sent on. The page was lowered slightly. The dry smell of old books remained in the air, but now another scent on the sheet itself asked to be found. The starred title near the bottom, the one close to the rewritten line, was brought nearer to the nose, then the edge of the paper beside it. There, faint and sweet in a modest way, lingered the scent of paste. It was unlike the general dry smell of shelf paper and old boards. This was fresher, thinner, with the mild, tacky sweetness of adhesive used on wrapped paper or sealed bundles. She tested the rest of the sheet by comparison. Most of it smelled only of paper. The sweetness stayed strongest at one edge where the page had likely been held. "Do you notice it?" she asked. He leaned in and did. Paste. Near that title most of all. His eyes moved from the line to the starred words spoken a moment earlier. Then this may have been handled where wrapping was being done, or where wrapped things were being sorted. The clue did not blaze. It settled. Paste scent on one edge. A title about parcels among the selected lines. A practical margin mark. A list chosen by subject and then hidden only briefly. The mystery, which had begun as a misplaced page among books, shifted gently outward into the building's daily traffic. They looked once more at the stars as a whole. Firm answer now available was small but solid. The gold stars were not random embellishment. They isolated a subset of titles meant to be read together. That made the missing mark matter more sharply than before. It likely belonged to the one title needed to complete the instructions suggested by the initials and the pattern of movement. Whatever had been removed had not merely altered decoration. It had taken away part of the list's function. The faint paste scent and the word that had settled among them drew the matter away from the shelves and cabinet. What had seemed a private note among books now pointed towards something handled in the ordinary flow of deliveries, something left or collected with little enough ceremony that a list might be consulted, set down on the cabinet for a moment, and then hidden in haste when footsteps approached or attention shifted. The return slips still rested where they had been set aside. The page was placed atop them, rather than tucked into a pocket or under an arm. Kept visible and flat, it looked easier to think with, as though preserving its order would help preserve the order of what had been learned from it. One hand held the stack by the lower edge. The other gave the map drawer cabinet a final look, taking in the clean arc on its dusty top, the drawer lip, the narrow place where the corner had caught. Silas remained beside her, his attention still on the list. He did not step ahead. He waited for the direction of the search to declare itself. "The side entrance table," she said quietly. He inclined his head. "Where parcels are left." The folded handbill rustled once more as he fell in beside her. The reading room behind them stayed exactly as it had been. Long tables in order, chairs tucked in, silver labels catching light up on the gallery, the soft page-turning hush undisturbed. Yet the task had changed shape. The hidden place under the drawer mattered less now than the ordinary place where paste, paper, and brief handling might have met. With the list held carefully by one edge and the return slips beneath it, she turned from the cabinet and began toward that clearer line of inquiry, while he kept pace at her side, and the room let them pass without a sound. Chapter 2. Brown repair paper lay smoothed across the work surface, its creases pressed out under patient palms until it held a broad, even plane of warm matte color. A delicate volume rested in the center of it, already turned once and then settled back while the corners were judged. When the book was lifted again and angled into the paper, a dry whisper followed the movement, soft as leaves brushing a sleeve. The sound belonged to work, done often enough that the hands performing it no longer hurried. One edge folded in while a thumb held it there, and the opposite side came over in a neat slope, then paused before the final turn. Near the wrapping, the list from beside the map drawer cabinet lay atop the return slips, kept flat and clean, its corners aligned with a care that made it part of the work rather than a thing abandoned beside it. The earlier question of the starred travel titles had not drifted away. It had merely been placed where it could wait without disordering anything else. A strip of tissue and a repair label were needed before the parcel could be finished. The newspaper file cabinet, old enough to keep its habits, gave a small resisting catch before the drawer came free. Silver labels, their lettering worn smooth in places by years of fingertips, passed beneath a searching hand, one by one. Dust rose faintly from the pressed paper within, carrying that dry, settled smell that belongs only to old files and folded notices and clippings that have rested a long while together. The errand itself was ordinary: tissue, label, a little finishing work. Yet the same thread that ran through the list remained under it all: parcels, sorting, the sweet paste trace that had clung strongest near the word parcels on the hidden paper. Even while reaching into the cabinet for practical things, the mind at work there had not left the puzzle behind. Contents shifted only after they had been straightened. A row of papers that had leaned a little to one side was nudged true. Loose slips were tapped level against the bottom of the drawer. Fingertips moved along each silver heading and date instead of dipping in at random. Records were trusted to keep their own order if given the chance. On the table behind, the returned slip stayed clear of the wrapping paper, and the list remained square to both. A receipt edge had caught where it should not have caught. The small interruption showed itself near the back of the drawer. One return receipt lifted slightly above the rest, as though it had been tucked in quickly and never pressed flat. It was that unevenness that drew the eye, though once the paper was eased up, another wrongness held it there. Beside one entry sat an extra mark, unlike the neat receiving ticks elsewhere on the slip. The ordinary wrapping paused with one fold still untucked. The receipt was brought nearer the light. Held flat at first, it showed only the line itself, small and penciled. Tilted a little, it began to offer more. The pressure of the pencil lingered in the paper grain, visible where the graphite had faded. What had seemed like a correction changed shape under that slanting light. It was no simple crossing out or accidental touch of a point. A tiny ring sat there with a short tail set close beside it. That shape was small enough to stir another image at once. The faint circular impression on the starred list where a mark had once been and then removed. Not one of the gold stars still remaining. Those were larger, brighter, complete in themselves. This was nearer in size to the absent thing, the little hollow left behind when a mark had been taken away so carefully that only pressure and a whisper of gum had remained. The receipt was lowered to the cleared patch of wood and then raised again. This time, closer still, the entry beside the odd mark named a return connected to a travel title. The title itself sat among the ordinary borrowings in practical pencil, but the due notation beside it had been overwritten once so lightly that the earlier figure nearly disappeared into the fibers of the paper. A 7, perhaps, beneath a 9. Or the other way around. The first number had not been fully erased, only persuaded into silence by a second firmer hand. Below that, written in thinner pencil, stood the word hold, followed by 2 short strokes. Those strokes were small. They might have passed unnoticed if the eye had not already been tuned by the hidden list. There, once, in the margin of that concealed paper, a single pair of practical little lines had appeared beside one of the titles, angled with the same unornamented purpose. On the receipt, they did not behave like decoration. They looked like working marks, placed to mean something to someone handling papers and objects in motion. The slip was turned over. The reverse should have been blank, except for the pressure of what had been written on the front, but a rubbed patch broke the surface near one side. The paper there looked slightly dulled, as though something had been written and then worked at with finger or cloth until the graphite thinned away. A fingernail passed lightly over it. Under the rubbed place, letters could still be felt. Their bodies had gone pale, yet the grooves remained, and in the right angle of light, a fragment at the end still held enough graphite to be read, "Table," in the same practical slant as the hidden list. The missing beginning left the word unsettled. It might have meant the side entrance table. It might have belonged to some other table entirely, some sorting place known to the hand that wrote it. The paper gave no more than that ending, and the rubbed patch kept the rest to itself. A second fold in the receipt made itself known only when the slip was opened fully. Something narrow had been tucked inside. The piece came free with care, a torn scrap from the edge of a notice. It was too slight to carry a whole instruction, only a printed line cut off at one end and broken at the other, ending in the words "left before noon." One torn side held a faint, dry sweetness. The scent was not strong enough to announce itself at once, but once noticed it was unmistakable. Old paste, the same kind of sweetness that had gathered most clearly near parcels on the starred list. The scrap was held closer to the nose, then laid down and touched again. The sweetness lived in the paper rather than on it, as if the edge had once been fixed to something and then pulled away. It began to look as though the receipt had traveled with instructions and then been stored in haste after the work was done. The tiny ring with its tail drew attention back to itself. Studied once, it had looked unusual. Studied longer, it began to look deliberate in a different way. Ring first, tail second. A token noted and then altered, or a removable sign recorded in pencil when the object itself could not stay with the paper. Its size refused to match the gold stars still clinging to the hidden list. It matched the absent circular impression instead. If one hand had used both systems, then the marked return entry and the missing marked title might once have belonged together, each part reflecting the other in different records. The work surface held several kinds of order now. Brown wrapping paper with its half-completed folds, return slips stacked by date, the hidden list kept flat, the newly found receipt and torn scrap near the center, where the light was best. A repair label still unfetched. The cabinet drawer remained open, its contents waiting. Porcelain cups arrived before a voice did, cushioned in a folded cloth and set down with the soft chink of careful handling. The sound came from the edge of the table, and when the bundle opened a little, pale rims showed between the cloth folds. Cool air from the street still clung faintly to Ivy's sleeves. Her attention, though, went at once to the receipt held above the open drawer. "What have you found?" The question was plain and low, shaped more by practical interest than surprise. The receipt was angled toward her, with the torn scrap beside it, offered for looking without being given away entirely. That kind of invitation suited the moment better than explanation. Her gaze moved over the penciled entry, the extra mark, the fold where the scrap had been hidden. When the mention came of parcels in the side entrance table, she leaned closer to the torn edge rather than to the writing. "That scent," she said, touching the air above the paper instead of the paper itself. "Paste used for temporary notices, the sort fixed up for a few hours and taken down again before the day is over." The words settled neatly among the clues already laid out. The scrap's printed ending about something being left before noon now sounded less like a public announcement and more like a practical instruction meant for whoever was handling deliveries or collections at the side entrance table. The delicate volume remained half-wrapped, paper turned in but untied. Its unfinished state marked the moment more clearly than any spoken decision. The wrapping was not abandoned carelessly. It was simply no longer the nearest task. The book was moved a little higher on the work surface, where the folds would hold and no edge would slip open. In the cleared patch beneath, the return receipt took its place. The hidden list and the return slips were drawn close. The investigation began in the same manner the wrapping had begun, by making things square. Dates on the return receipt were checked against the return slips one by one. Names mattered less than sequence. A finger traced down one column, crossed to another, returned to the receipt, then back again. Travel-themed titles had moved through on that day in a small cluster, several returns close together, enough to require temporary sorting away from the main desk if parcels or holds had also been passing through. One title alone might have meant little. A cluster changed the shape of the hour. Ivy stood beside the table, one hand on the folded cloth near the cups, watching the papers shift into relation. From time to time, she pointed without touching. "That one follows the same morning batch," she said once, "and these two came back together if the sequence was kept properly." It had been kept properly. The records showed it. The two short strokes beneath "hold" on the receipt asked for a closer comparison than memory alone could provide. The hidden list was brought nearer and turned so both papers could lie edge to edge. For a while, there was no speaking. Only the slight scrape of paper on wood and the careful settling of corners until the marks sat almost level with one another. Seen separately, each pair of strokes might have remained uncertain. Side by side, their slant became harder to dismiss. Both leaned with the same brisk angle, as if made by a hand that moved quickly, but expected to read itself later. The spacing matched as well. A small gap, then a second line just a little shorter. They were not decorative. They were practical signs, repeated because they meant something consistent. A finger hovered above the list's margin, then above the receipt. The eye traveled from one to the other and back again, testing whether likeness had been imagined into them. The more they were aligned, the less accidental they seemed. The hidden list had not been drafted and forgotten in a drawer. It had been carried into use, its titles serving some working purpose among objects being physically separated, held, or passed along. That was done while moving things, Ivy said, not while deciding what to write later. The thought fit the marks better than any tidy theory. One paper named titles. The other recorded a return. Both bore the sign of handling. The reverse side of the receipt came back under attention. The rubbed patch with its surviving ending was not read by ink alone now. A fingertip followed the pressure of the letters, feeling where the pencil had pressed down and where it had lifted. The hidden list was tested in the same way, one line at a time, until the rewritten title near the bottom offered a useful comparison. There, in the final word, the pencil had finished with a firmer downward press than the rest of the line. On the receipt's reverse, the ending of table showed the same habit, a practical hand ending with weight. The similarity did not prove identity by itself. Plenty of hands press harder at the end of a word, yet the combination of slant, pressure, and purpose began to gather. One writer seemed increasingly likely behind both papers. The list dealt in titles. The receipt's reverse carried handling instructions. The two tracks ran close without becoming one. The torn scrap was lifted again and held near the hidden list. Its sweetness had seemed strongest at the pasted edge, but now the list itself was tested against it by scent. The paper did not smell generally of paste. Only one area answered, the place where parcels appeared among the starred travel titles. There the faint, dry sweetness strengthened, not enough to stain the whole page, only enough to suggest that portion had once lain against pasted paper or a notice board surface. Perhaps the list had been tucked behind a temporary notice. Perhaps it had rested under one. Whatever the exact contact, the scent tied the list more firmly to wrapped items and posted instructions than to ordinary shelving work. Ivy drew in a small breath over the papers. If that list spent time near a notice, it wasn't just a private reminder. No, came the answer, quiet and occupied with the alignment of corners. Something was being handled from it. The records offered another path when read together rather than separately. The starred travel titles on the hidden list might have done more than name books. They might have doubled as a coded checklist for items expected at the side entrance table. The missing marked title, removed from the list and echoed by the tiny ring on the receipt, could have completed both the directional fragment from before and the handling order implied by these signs. In that reading, the extra mark beside the return entry ceased to look like a borrower's note. It became a sign that one expected item had arrived, changed hands, or been set aside. The idea did not settle all at once. It took shape through the papers themselves. A cluster of travel returns, a hold notation, matching strokes, a rubbed instruction ending in table, a scrap from a temporary notice with old paste and a printed line about something left before noon. Each clue had first stood apart. Together, they began to form a modest structure, still open at the sides, but sturdy enough to lean on. What would need hiding in title choices? Ivy asked. The question remained on the table with the papers. There were many reasons to sort parcels quietly. Some were ordinary enough, avoiding confusion, keeping collections separate, managing arrivals before the main desk was ready. Yet the removable mark, the hidden list, the folded scrap, and the rubbed instructions suggested more care than routine alone required. The newspaper file cabinet, already open, invited a narrower search. No longer was the hand seeking tissue or labels. It moved past brittle clippings and old newspaper pieces toward the shallower pocket where odds and ends were often kept before proper filing. The search there had a different touch from rummaging. Papers were lifted in little groups and replaced if they proved irrelevant. Ribbon ends, threadbare and flattened, turned up first. Then a sheet with pinholes along one edge, another with a faint pasted patch. Small signs accumulated that temporary notices had indeed been bundled here after use, tied up and set aside once their hour had passed. Behind them, the half-wrapped volume waited with one corner folded in and one still open. Its unfinished state had become a measure of time passing. The repair work had not been forgotten. It had simply yielded to retrieval. Whatever had been posted or sorted seemed more likely now to explain the missing title than the drawer-side list could on its own. The papers already found were stacked in a careful order before the search went deeper. Hidden list at the bottom, returned slips over that, return receipt above them, with one corner left visible, torn scrap laid so its printed edge could still be seen. Even interruption had its methods. Records might speak more clearly once arranged than once argued over. The cabinet gave up more dust than answers for a little while. Announcements too old to matter slid aside, their paper stiff and faint at the folds. A clipped notice caught briefly on a splintered edge and then came free. The silver labels along the drawer front glimmered dully whenever the light shifted. Beside the open drawer, the folded cloth around the cups remained untouched, one porcelain rim peeking out in patient silence. Then the fingertips met resistance at the back. A run of outdated announcements, all similar in size, hid a thicker packet behind them. It came free in one dusty lift, a bundle of old notices tied with ribbon. The ribbon had flattened under long pressure, its loops pressed nearly smooth. That answered one small question at once. The torn scrap had likely come from stored temporary notices, not from any current posting still on display. The bundle was set in the place where the delicate volume had nearly been finished. That placement alone changed the table's use. Repair paper became sorting ground. The cups weighted to one side. The half-wrapped book was moved safely aside. Beyond the spread of dust and ribbon fibers, its unfinished folds kept intact so no ordinary work would be spoiled by curiosity. One practical thread had settled into something near certainty. The extra mark beside the entry on the return receipt belonged to the same temporary handling system as the hidden list and the side entrance table. It did not belong to ordinary borrowing notation. That much the papers had earned. What remained open lay underneath. Why a message about movement and parcels had needed to hide itself inside title choices and small removable marks at all. The ribbon waited under steady fingers, not yet loosened. For a moment, the attention on the table widened enough to include everything at once. The brown repair paper spread beneath old dust, the delicate volume resting safely beyond it, the cups in their folded cloth, the stacked papers with their corners left visible, and the bundle of notices tied long ago and kept where temporary things go when they are no longer needed but not yet ready to disappear. Ivy glanced toward the cups and then back to the ribbon. Tea can wait. It did. The old notices were not opened immediately. Before the knot was touched, the stack of clue papers was shifted another inch away from the dust, and the half-wrapped volume was checked once more to be sure no edge of repair paper would spring back against it. That small act of care preserved the ordinary work of the room even while the investigation drew nearer to its next answer. Only after that did the ribbon's flattened tail get lifted between finger and thumb. Somewhere within the bundle, perhaps, lay the missing notice. Perhaps only another fragment. Perhaps the absent title mark that would complete the broken pattern on the list. The question waited there with the dust and ribbon, quiet and exacting, while the work table held itself ready. Chapter 3. The willow basket was already open beneath the little cabinet of framed photographs and keepsakes, as though the evening had simply paused there and was now willing to continue. Old papers rested in it with the loose, layered give of things handled over many seasons. When Mabel's fingers slipped between them, saved notes whispered against one another in a dry, papery hush. The smell rising from the basket was faint and particular. Old paste, pressed stems gone flat between pages, and a sweetness light enough to disappear beneath any stronger scent. A small stack from the library had come home in careful order and was set beside her own papers with the same care. The hidden list, return slips, the return receipt, the torn scrap, and the dusty bundle of old notices tied with flattened ribbon. Their edges did not quite match. Some were clipped and square. Others had softened in pockets, on shelves, and beneath passing hands. Together they seemed to belong to two lives at once, the public life of Bramble Nook and the private life of a house where lists were made for mending, flour, lamp oil, and all the small things that let days move along. The ribbon around the old notices had been pressed nearly flat by time. When Mabel loosened it, the fabric dragged softly against itself, reluctant to leave the shape of the knot. Dust lay in the folds where the ribbon had crossed. The notices opened in uneven layers, one slipping free and then another, corners catching and releasing. Some carried thicker traces of paste. Some had been folded so often that pale lines crossed them like tiny roads. One notice shared the rubbed, handled feel of the scrap ending in "left before noon." The likeness lived in the paper itself, the softened grain, the faint shine where fingertips had passed over the same place, the dry sweetness of old adhesive. Mabel laid the two pieces near each other and left a narrow space between them. Before reading further, she squared the notices into a neat row and smoothed one curled corner with the side of her thumb until it agreed to lie down. The habit slowed her hands just enough for the eye to work properly. Patterns had always preferred a still surface. Among the saved notes in the basket lay a handwritten list of mending to be done. The upper portion suited the rest of the household papers: hems, a cuff, a loose hook, the brisk domestic shorthand of tasks to be remembered and crossed away. The writing moved lightly, with the steady pressure of someone setting down work already understood. At the bottom, an added line sat differently on the page. The letters pressed harder into the paper. The hand was narrower, the spacing crowded, as though the writer had found a small strip of room and used it quickly. Back table button packet, keep aside. The earlier rubbed instruction ending in table stirred at once in memory. Buttons belonged naturally on a mending list. Keep aside carried the practical tone of handling. Separate this from the rest and leave it where another pair of hands could find it. Mabel drew one of her household notes from the basket and placed it beside the list. The comparison separated the hands cleanly. Her own writing opened across the page with easy spacing. The added words bore down more firmly and crowded toward the edge. The button packet sat with the sewing things. Soft paper folded over itself around a slight bulge, easy to overlook during a search. When she opened it, several plain buttons settled into her palm. Dull pearl, dark horn, two with chipped edges, and one brown piece worn smooth at the rim. A single button carried a narrow strip of paper through the loop of its shank. Mabel lifted it closer to the lamp. The strip had been threaded through with care, folded once, and drawn snug enough to stay in place among the other buttons. Cramped writing curved along the paper. Beneath the word "hold" sat two tiny strokes, the same small marks that had appeared on returned slips beside handling language. The arch of the shank sheltered the strip from rubbing against its neighbors. Someone had trimmed the paper to fit that narrow channel and trusted the surrounding buttons to hide it. She eased the strip free. Its bend resisted for a moment, then loosened with a dry whisper. One edge remained torn and fibrous. The rest had been cut from a larger sheet. As the scrap warmed between her fingers, the scent of old paste rose from it, matching the torn fragment and the notices on the table. 3 words survived the trimming: gate, before, and a final rubbed word. At one angle, it resembled table. When the first stroke lengthened in the light, stable became possible. Where had settled precisely over the letter that would decide it. Mabel turned the scrap once beneath the lamp and then laid it beside the fragment ending in left before noon. The pieces came from separate parts of the same kind of posted material, joined by softened surfaces, old adhesive, and the wear of repeated handling. The mending list held another small disturbance. Close to the end of the added instructions sat a ring with tail mark. The return receipt carried the same working symbol. Here the circle closed less smoothly and the tail dragged, as though the mark had been copied in haste. Under the added line, faint buried letters pressed up through the darker writing. The beginning looked like Gar, before the overstroke swallowed the rest. Mabel shifted the lamp a little closer. The fragment remained stubborn, though garden came easily to mind. Folded inside the button packet was a second wrapping, narrower than the packet and creased into a slim band. When opened, it offered a count in blunt working language: 3 kept/1 sent back. The reverse carried no garment, size, color, or owner's name. The count belonged to a process of separation and return. Whatever the packet had once represented, part of a set had been held apart, and one part had gone back through the same chain. Mabel left the papers where they were and covered the unusual button with an empty saucer so it could not roll. The room had grown warmer around the lamp. Beyond the window, the last clear light rested along the upper branches of the pear tree. At the far end of the table, a length of fabric waited beneath a folded paper pattern. She had bought it several weeks earlier after carrying the bolt twice from the draper's shelf to the window and back again. In the shop, it had looked almost blue. At home, under afternoon light, the color settled into a deep green with a quiet thread of gray through it, like rosemary leaves after rain. Tiny cream flowers were printed across the cloth at wide intervals. From a distance, they nearly disappeared. Up close, each had 5 narrow petals and a dark stitched-looking center. The dress had been intended for the library. Its skirt would fall softly below the knee, with enough width to move between the reading tables and kneel beside the lowest shelves. The bodice crossed gently at the front. 3/4 sleeves would keep loose fabric away from ink, paste, and the corners of old bindings. Mabel had chosen a narrow cream piping for the collar and cuffs, just enough to catch the eye when the green cloth passed through lamplight. She drew the cut pieces toward her and lifted the left sleeve from its paper wrapping. Pins waited in a round tomato cushion, each one set at nearly the same angle. The sleeve seam had been basted earlier in long, pale stitches. She checked the curve against the armhole, eased the fabric beneath her fingers, and found the small place where the gathering had grown uneven. The work asked for patience of a different kind. Cloth answered through tension and fall. A line could be perfect on paper and still pull once it met the shoulder. Mabel removed 3 basting stitches, loosened the fullness along the sleeve cap, and distributed it again with the point of a pin. When the curve lay smoothly, she set the sleeve into the bodice and worked around it in small sections. Pin, turn, ease, pin. Again, the cream flowers drifted in and out of view as the fabric folded across her hands. One landed near the shoulder seam, another close to the cuff. She moved the cuff piece 1/2 inch so the second flower would remain visible beside the piping. The room narrowed to cloth, pinheads, and the faint pull of thread. At the library, Mabel kept titles with readers, returns with records, and questions with the right shelf. Sewing gathered that order closer to the body. A seam had to follow a shoulder that would lift and reach. A cuff had to leave room for a wrist bending over a page. The dress would spend its days among books, though it began here with pins, chalk, and the soft pull of thread through cloth. Mabel threaded a needle with green cotton and drew the end across a small piece of beeswax. The thread darkened slightly and lost its tendency to twist. She began the new basting line, each stitch long enough to remove later, and even enough to keep the sleeve from shifting while she tried the bodice on. The needle entered and emerged with a steady little rhythm. Outside, a blackbird gave 3 liquid notes from the hedge. Somewhere near the kitchen, the clock on the mantel prepared itself and struck the half-hour with a warm, contained sound. When the sleeve was secured, Mabel held the bodice against herself before the long mirror near the cabinet. The green deepened beside her dark skirt. The collar pieces still hung loose, and one side remained open from underarm to waist, yet the shape had begun to show. She turned slightly. The sleeve sat cleanly at the shoulder. The cream piping would brighten the neckline, leaving the small flowers as its quietest detail. She lowered the bodice and unfolded the skirt panels. 2 pocket pieces lay between them, cut from a lighter cotton so they would add little weight at the hips. Mabel pinned one pocket mouth against the side seam and held the panel to herself, testing where her hand reached naturally. The first placement sat too low. She moved it upward by the width of 2 fingers and tried again. This time her hand slipped into the opening easily. The pockets would have work to do. One could carry the small brass key to the library's inner record cupboard. The other would take a pencil, a handkerchief, or the folded request slips that followed her away from the desk when a reader needed help among the shelves. She deepened each pocket bag slightly on the paper pattern before tracing the change onto the cotton. A loose pencil had a way of turning sideways at the least useful moment. These would be deep enough to keep one upright. The green thread returned to the needle. She stitched along the curved edge of the first pocket bag, then clipped the seam allowance where the curve tightened. The cotton opened smoothly when turned. Mabel pressed it flat with the back of her thumbnail and laid it against the dress panel once more. The hidden pocket preserved the clean fall of the skirt and waited inside the seam, useful and nearly invisible. A shallow wooden box beneath the pattern held the buttons chosen for the dress. 6 were needed for the cuffs and the inner fastening. Mabel opened the lid and arranged them in her palm. They were cream shell, smooth at the front, with 4 small holes and a faint green cast that appeared when the light moved across them. Her sewing note lay beneath the box. 6 cream shell, 1/2 inch, 4 hole, 2 for each cuff, 2 inside. Every detail necessary for the work had been written down. Size, material, number, and placement belonged together because the dress demanded them. Her gaze returned to the narrow wrapping on the other end of the table. 3 kept/1 sent back belonged to a different task. The packet had borrowed the appearance of sewing while carrying a working count. Mabel closed the button box and placed it beside the folded collar. The dress could wait until morning for a fitting in full daylight. She covered the pinned bodice with a clean square of muslin, protecting the cream fabric from dust and the old paste lingering around the papers. The pear tree beyond the window had begun to darken into one broad shape. Garden watering still waited. She carried the lamp to the back passage, left it on the small side table, and stepped into the evening with the galvanized watering can. The metal handle felt cool through her palm. A shallow skin of rainwater waited in the barrel beside the wall, enough to fill the can without drawing from the kitchen tap. The garden held the warmth of the day low among its leaves. Beans climbed their poles in loose green spirals. Calendula gathered the last light in orange cups. Along the path, thyme released its dry, clean scent where her skirt brushed the edge. Mabel watered slowly at the roots, giving the soil time to darken before moving on. The young lettuces took a narrow stream. The rosemary needed less. A row of chives had begun to lean across the path, their purple heads gone soft with seed. Mabel gathered them gently to one side and cut 3 spent stems with the small garden scissors kept in her apron pocket. The fresh ends released a green onion-sharp scent that faded almost as soon as it rose. At the far bed, sweet peas had wound themselves through the netting and reached beyond it in pale curling threads. She guided one wandering stem back toward the support and tied it with a short length of soft twine kept around the can's handle. 2 blossoms had opened since morning, one cream and one pale mauve. Mabel left them on the vine for the kitchen window to catch at breakfast. Near the fence, a patch of calendula had scattered petals over the dark soil. She pinched away the finished heads and placed them in the pocket of her apron. Their seeds could dry in a saucer and wait for spring inside a labeled envelope, another small season, kept in paper until the garden asked for it again. From there, the garden gate stood a few paces away. Its latch opened inward with a familiar scrape. Beyond it ran the narrow side path, screened from the road by the hedge and sheltered from the kitchen windows by the angle of the house. A person entering there could reach the back door without crossing the front garden. The little side table waited beneath the eave beside the door, where Mabel set seed trays in spring and baskets of cut herbs in summer. Deliveries left there would stay dry through a brief rain. She stood with one hand on the gate and looked along the path. Gar, gate, back table. The fragments belonged easily to the space. Garden gate, back table. A route from one to the other required a dozen quiet steps and passed beneath the cover of the hedge for most of the way. Mabel closed the gate and tested the latch. It caught securely, though its iron tongue gave a small click that might be lost beneath wind, rain, or the ordinary sounds of a house. She followed the side path toward the door, carrying the watering can at her knee. At the table, She paused long enough to see the shallow rings left by flower pots and the pale square where a basket had protected the wood from weather. The table had always seemed part of the garden's practical edge, somewhere to set gloves, twine, seed packets, or a bowl of beans before carrying them inside. The old notices on her work table had mentioned deliveries left by a side entrance table. The phrase had sounded general when read indoors. Here, it described a useful handoff place with shelter, privacy, and a clear path from the gate. She finished watering the pots beneath the kitchen window and emptied the last cupful around the roots of the climbing rose. Drops remained along the can's spout, bright in the lamp glow from the passage. Inside, she dried her hands and returned to the papers. Back at the table, the fragments held a clearer order. She opened the bundle of old notices and searched with a single purpose. 2 mentioned goods being left by the side entrance table. Their wording was plain and practical, written for people already familiar with the house and its back path. One sheet held a small, clean place where a removable mark had once been pasted. Old adhesive stiffened the fibers around the empty patch. Its size came close to the ring with tail mark copied onto the mending list. A worker could have lifted the small piece, carried it with an item, and left the larger notice behind for everyone else. Mabel placed the notice beside the torn scrap and the strip from the button. The shared paste scent strengthened when the papers gathered. They came from the same kind of posted material, though their edges belonged to separate pieces. Instructions had been cut down to whatever a handler needed: a place, a time, a mark, a count. The hidden list and return receipt completed the arrangement. The repeated symbols now read as parts of a temporary working system. One item had been held apart. One had been sent back. The direction led through the garden gate toward the table beside the back door. The ring with tail mark had crossed from formal handling papers onto a household mending list because the list offered a safe place to carry it. Several questions remained. WS had yet to settle into a person or place. The rubbed word after before might still read stable. The count gave no names to the 3 kept items or the 1 returned. Mabel left those spaces open. She wrapped the unusual button and its strip in one of her saved notes, choosing a clean interior so the writing would not rub. The ordinary buttons returned to their packet. The narrow count wrapping stayed with the evidence, separate from the sewing things now that its purpose had declared itself. The dusty notices were retied with their flattened ribbon. Mabel placed the relevant papers into a carry bundle in the order she would need them: hidden list, return receipt, torn scrap, count wrapping, and the wrapped button. The notice mentioning the side entrance table went beneath them to keep the smaller pieces flat. Above the table, the little cabinet of framed photographs and keepsakes held its quiet watch. The willow basket remained open beneath it, older notes and pressed stems resting around the spaces where the evening's papers had been drawn. At the far end of the table, the green dress waited under muslin, one sleeve newly settled into place. Mabel lifted the bundle and carried it to the side passage. Through the glass of the back door, the path lay dim between the house and hedge. The gate could barely be seen from inside, though the table beneath the eave stood within reach of the lamp. The papers had given her a route. The garden had shown how easily it could be used. Chapter 4. The small basket of cut flowers rested against one hip, cool stems damp through the weave where they touched, while the tidy bundle of papers stayed tucked beneath the other arm. The back way asked for a slower pace than the front walk did. Soil still clung in a dark ribbon to the hem of Mabel's skirt, and each step along the path had to be measured enough that nothing slid loose. Behind her, the garden gate gave its familiar wooden click and settled into place. Ahead, the back door stood plain and useful, with the side entrance table visible just beyond the turn of the wall, waiting in the ordinary way of things that were used every day and therefore rarely looked at twice. Against the basket handle, the gathered clues shifted into a more orderly stack with the practiced pressure of a thumb. The hidden list, the return receipt, the torn scrap ending in left before noon, and the unusual button wrapped with its strip. The papers had a way of wanting to fan apart whenever they were carried, each one eager to show a corner of itself. She pressed them flatter, then let her glance travel where her thoughts had already begun to travel without asking leave of her hands. The latch at the garden gate, the line of the path, the back door, the side entrance table ahead. Before she stepped inside, she was already weighing the route against the papers, seeing whether the clues in the place might settle into the same order. One bent flower stem had worked itself out of line near the rim of the basket. It was turned inward with the same careful fingers that kept recipe cards square and saved notes in proper little piles. The bundle beneath her arm received another smoothing press. What mattered just then was less any grand reason behind the hidden things than the sequence itself. Gate, path, back door, side entrance table. The thought arranged itself as neatly as the papers did, and she held to it while crossing the last few stones. By the time she reached the side approach, the paper packet of buttons had become the wrong thing to put away. Its shape was familiar enough in itself. A folded little packet no larger than a palm, the sort of thing one might tuck into an apron pocket and forget until mending time. Yet when it was held beside an ordinary fastening on the apron pocket near the basket rim, the difference showed at once. The pocket button was plain, modest, and complete in its purpose. It belonged to cloth and strain and daily use. The unusual one inside its wrapping did not settle so quietly into that same category. It asked to be compared, as though it had been carried for where it had gone, rather than for what it was. The side entrance table stood close enough now to touch in passing, its wood worn smooth in some places and faintly ridged in others, where weather and hands had worked together over time. The strip wrapped with the unusual button was set lightly against the tabletop, while the basket was shifted for balance. single movement, casual as it might have looked to anyone passing by, sharpened one troublesome word at once. The rubbed letters on the strip had refused to settle quietly into either table or stable when seen only as writing. Here, beside the weathered board itself, table gained a bodily sort of sense. This was an ordinary surface, marked by trays and bowls and parcels, and hands coming and going. If the hidden instruction had named such a place, then what had seemed puzzling on paper became practical in wood. The basket was lowered to the side entrance table, though not fully released yet. Flowers breathed up their cool green scent, touched with the faint sweetness that rose after cutting. Moisture from the stems darkened one small patch of the basket weave. The papers remained under her arm for a moment longer while she looked from the tabletop to the back door and then over her shoulder toward the garden gate again, measuring the distance with her eyes in the same way one might measure a hem before chalking it. Nothing in the route was long or dramatic. That, perhaps, was the point. The bundle came down at last and was laid beside the basket. She slipped the paper packet of buttons free and opened it a little more carefully than before, using one finger to ease apart the fold so as not to disturb the unusual button and its strip. The outer paper had already shown itself to be more than a shop wrapper. Inside, on the inner fold where a person would only look if they had reason to open the packet completely, pencil marks had pressed themselves into the fibers. 3 kept, 1 sent back. The count sat hidden in a place no ordinary tally ought to be. Shop marks belonged on the outside, where they could be read at a glance. This one had been tucked into privacy, written for the eye of whoever handled the packet closely enough to unfold it past the useful point. She held the paper nearer the light that came slanting along the side wall and looked again, not because the words were hard to read, but because the hand behind them was trying to say more than the words themselves would admit. The numbers had been written with pressure. The pencil had bitten down at the 3 and the 1, leaving little grooves visible even where the graphite had gone pale. The words between and after them were lighter, as though the writer had cared more for the count than for the explanation. Kept, sent back. The phrase could have belonged to buttons if one insisted on the simplest answer. Yet even in the hand that made it, there was something less like mending and more like sorting. The packet rested in her palm with almost no weight, and still the penciled line inside it seemed to add a kind of heaviness. She tipped the packet so the unusual button slid a fraction against its wrapping. The paper made a dry little whisper. 3 kept, 1 sent back. If the count referred to buttons, then there should have been some plain reason for separating them. Size, color, damage, mismatch. Nothing in the packet offered such a reason. If it referred to parcels or notes or something hidden under the appearance of sewing stock, then the packet had served as a ledger in miniature, one folded shut and carried in plain sight. Her thumb paused over the penciled count without touching it. The placement mattered almost as much as the words. Whoever wrote it had not meant it for a public label. It was a private check, hidden where only a handler would think to look. The paper itself had become less wrapper than record. Beside it, the strip around the unusual button waited with its own quiet insistence. She lifted it free and laid it flat on the side entrance table, careful not to pull the fibers where it had already torn. The rubbed word sat along one portion of the strip, faint from handling, the letters softened into uncertainty. Near one torn edge, a chalky smear caught the light differently from the rest of the paper. It was not broad enough to be an accidental dusting from a hand. A faint straight line had settled into the chalk, slight but deliberate, as though the strip had once lain against a marked surface and borrowed the mark from it. She bent closer. The chalk itself had a dry bloom, pale against the paper. When the strip was tilted, the line showed and then nearly vanished, depending on how the light reached it. Wear would have rubbed irregularly. This did not. The line held to one direction, true enough to suggest edge or measure. Scissors came to mind because of the torn end and the narrowness of the strip. Chalk came to mind because of the powdery residue. Some measured task came after both, because a straight mark implied intention before cutting or wrapping. A fingertip hovered over the smear and stopped short of touching. Rubbing would only blur what little was there. She lowered her hand to the table instead and looked from the chalky trace to the basket, to the apron pocket button she had used for comparison, and back again. The unusual button had seemed important when first found, simply because it was unusual. Here on the table, with the strip unwrapped and showing its own signs, the button began to look more like a weight, a way to keep paper attached to paper. The hidden list was drawn from the bundle next. Its folds had been opened and closed enough that the paper now gave with a softened crackle rather than a crisp one. Along one line, the overwritten gar still held the eye. At a glance, it could almost pass for the beginning of a complete word. At a slower look, it was clearly a correction crowded over itself. One stroke had begun, then another had come over it in haste, as though the writer had started to write one destination and changed it before finishing, but not before leaving the first impulse behind. She angled the list toward the light in the same way she had angled the strip. The crowded pencil strokes showed their order more clearly that way. The earlier line sat slightly lower, the later one pressing over it, trying to guide the eye elsewhere. It might have meant garden. It might have meant something meant to resemble garden. The uncertainty remained, yet the change itself was impossible to ignore. A person writing plainly had no reason to crowd one beginning with another. This had the look of someone concealing the instruction even from their own first hand, correcting not for neatness, but for disguise. The side entrance table stood under the list, as if offering itself up for comparison. Garden gate, path, back door, table. The route was beginning to gather under the papers in a way that made the back way feel less like a habit of walking and more like a written line traced through the house's ordinary use. Footsteps sounded then from the side approach, measured enough that the gravel gave only a small answering crunch. Before the figure reached the turn, a folded handbill corner appeared from a coat pocket, pale against darker cloth. The pause that followed was careful rather than abrupt, the kind made by someone who had seen another person occupied and chosen not to break the thread of thought too roughly. Silas came down from the direction of Larkin Loaf with travel papers still about him, the handbill peeking from his pocket and a dusting at the edge of one shoe where the road had dried there. He arrived at the back way as naturally as if the path had expected him, just while the clues were being set against the house itself. The basket of cut flowers was shifted farther onto the side entrance table to free one hand. The paper packet of buttons remained where it was, visible between the flowers and the hidden list. Nothing was tucked away. Nothing was covered. The choice kept the moment practical. Another pair of observant eyes could be useful here, and there was no need to pretend the papers were anything other than what they had become. His gaze moved over the arrangement without hurry. Basket, packet, strip, list, the edge of the receipt beneath. "You've brought the garden in with the puzzle," he said, stopping near enough to see but leaving the table's working space clear. "And the path with it," she answered, glancing toward the gate. "I thought I had only papers in hand. The house had other ideas." He came a little closer then, the handbill corner shifting in his pocket as he leaned. The flowers between them gave off their faint sweetness, and for a moment the clues sat among stems and leaves as though they had grown there. The strip was laid along the edge of the side entrance table. Wood met paper. The rubbed words sat where place and writing could be tested against one another, instead of only sounded out in the mind. From the garden gate to this table was no great distance. A person could come by the back way, sheltered by the wall and the turn of the path, and set something down quickly without needing the front of the house at all. The route's plain usefulness made it more persuasive, not less. Silas rested 2 fingers on the tabletop beside the strip without touching the clue itself. If someone meant another person to follow this, he said, they would choose what could be found by touch and routine. A latch, a path underfoot, a table that is always here. "The writing still has to lead there reasonably," she said. "I don't want the place to persuade us beyond what the paper allows." "No," he said with a small nod, "only enough to tell us which ordinary thing the writer trusted." The return receipt was drawn from beneath the list and set beside the open packet. Its paper was stiffer, more official in feel, though softened by handling at the corners. She held it near the penciled count inside the packet and let the 2 pieces sit in the same field of attention. The phrase in the packet had sounded ambiguous alone. Beside the receipt, it shifted. 3 kept, 1 sent back. A return receipt made the words lean away from inventory and toward action. Something had indeed gone back, or had been meant to. The packet's count no longer seemed like a shopkeeper's note about stock. It began to sound like a record of decisions made over more than one item. She traced the edge of the receipt with one nail, thoughtful enough not to mark it. If one was returned, she said, then the packet isn't counting loose buttons for mending. It's counting choices. Several parcels, perhaps, he said, or several pieces carried under one disguise. Something was refused or redirected, or judged unsuitable after arriving. The words did not resolve the matter, but they narrowed it. The packet had become a hidden account. The return receipt supported that reading. Whatever had been moving along this route did not travel as a single simple delivery. There had been sorting, selection. At least one item had gone back for some reason the paper still withheld. The torn scrap ending in "left before noon" came next. Its edge was ragged where the rest had been lost, the fibers lifting slightly like worn cloth threads. She held it in the same light as the hidden list, side by side, and the timing sharpened what the route had only suggested. Morning movement along the back way would pass with little notice. Someone carrying flowers from the garden, a bowl from the kitchen, a bit of mending. Any ordinary household thing could move from gate to back door to side entrance table while the front of the house remained busier and more watched. He looked from the scrap to the path as if measuring the hour in shadows. Before noon gives enough time for the house to be awake and occupied, he said. There would be work already underway. A person in the back would belong to the day. And leave little for anyone to remember later beyond ordinary movement, she said. The paper made a small sound as she lowered it. The route was no longer abstract. It had a likely time attached to it, a portion of the day in which such passing would have blended into everything else. The unusual button was lifted again, though this time it was not compared to the apron pocket or any piece of clothing. She set it on the side entrance table near a worn corner where years of handling had smoothed the wood. Its size and wear were judged against what an ordinary fastening nearby would endure. The button's edges showed use, yes, but not the kind that came from bearing strain against cloth day after day. The wear was lighter on one side, rubbed where fingers might have handled it. The holes had not pulled in the way heavily sewn buttons often did. Silas bent a little nearer. It mattered because it carried the strip, he said after a moment. That is what I think now. If it had belonged to a garment, we would expect the signs of that life on it. She turned the button with her fingertip. You mean it was chosen for being useful to wrap around? For pinning attention to the paper, perhaps? For making the packet seem ordinary? A button in a button packet invites no questions. The object that had first seemed central became cover. The strip had done the speaking all along. The button had only helped it pass unnoticed. On the hidden list, the overwritten beginning was tested again against the visible line of travel. With the garden gate behind them and the side entrance table before them, garden fit the starting point more cleanly than any indoor explanation. Yet the crowded correction in the word would not permit a full conclusion. She held the paper at arm's length, then closer. The first impulse had likely been to write the beginning plainly. The second had pressed over it, making the route less obvious to any eye that found the list. If it begins there, she said, looking toward the gate, the writer still did not want it read straight through. Then the concealment mattered as much as the instruction, he answered. The strip lay between them, and her fingertip followed the chalky smear without rubbing it away. Up close, the faint straight line in the chalk looked less accidental than before. The side entrance table had no chalk on it, no reason to give such a mark. Household work did, though. The shelf inside with scissors, chalk, and measuring tape belonged to tasks where straight lines mattered. Cloth was marked before cutting. Length was taken before trimming. Paper used in such work might easily brush against chalk or a measured edge. She let her finger hover over the line's length in the air. This begins to point somewhere ordinary, she said. The kind of ordinary that leaves marks and does not notice doing so, he replied. The workbox shelf came to mind with almost physical clarity then. Scissors with their familiar weight, chalk that left pale dust, measuring tape curled and waiting. The clue no longer felt sealed inside paper. It had reached outward into the habits of the house. Before turning from the table, they tested the table itself more thoroughly. A folded note could be left there without drawing any eye at all. A small parcel could rest beneath the edge of a folded cloth, beside gathered herbs, under a basket such as the one now breathing out the scent of cut stems. She set the basket down in one place, then another, seeing how easily it covered the corner of the tabletop. He looked from the door to the path and back again, considering how a hand might set something down while carrying kitchen things or mending or flowers. Its plain usefulness answered more than its appearance did. A remarkable place would have been remembered. This one would simply have been used. The hidden list and the strip were aligned edge to edge, not because their tiers matched, but because their wording seemed to move in the same rhythm. Place, object, movement, time. The order emerged by listening to the clues beside one another rather than reading each one alone. She heard sequence before motive announced itself. He heard it too, if the small lift of his brows meant what she thought it did. Whoever hid these expected the reader to know the house already, he said quietly. No stranger could follow such ordinary directions with confidence. No stranger would know which table mattered or why the back way was better than the front. The packet of buttons was opened fully at last. The inner fold spread wider, and the penciled count sat there in its hidden place with even more intention than before. Only a handler would ever think to look so deep into such a packet. That private placement strengthened what the return receipt had suggested. The sewing disguise had not only concealed an object, it had concealed record keeping. The packet served as an account book, small enough to vanish in a pocket. She flattened the fold gently against the table so the writing could be seen at its natural angle. The pressure in the numbers showed more clearly that way, the slight indentations catching shadow. This was for checking, she said, to make sure the right number had been dealt with. And hidden where no casual eye would find it, he said. A public label would sit outside. This sits with the handler. The basket handle creaked softly when she lifted it from where it had rested against the table edge. The sound was slight, but it returned the moment to the day's ordinary tasks. Flowers still needed putting down where they belonged. The back door still stood waiting. The clues had gathered their weight here, and the route had yielded what it could in open air. She drew the papers together loosely for carrying, though not yet into their final neat bundle. The strip remained separate in her hand for another breath, while she looked once more at the side entrance table, at the path leading back to the gate, and at the door that opened toward the shelf inside. One conclusion had settled firmly enough to keep. The rubbed word is more likely table, she said, almost to the wood itself. This fits too many parts of it. Silas glanced toward the yard beyond the wall. Stable still exists as a possibility in the abstract. In the abstract, yes. Here, less so. The stable possibility was not cast out entirely. It simply lost its place at the center. The side entrance table matched the route, the concealment, and the ordinary handling implied by every paper in hand. A hidden instruction naming this place would have practical sense. One naming some farther, less natural location would have to work harder than the clues themselves were asking it to. The unusual button was wrapped again, though with a different understanding. What mattered most had shifted from the button to the chalk-marked strip around it. The button remained useful as cover, still part of the clue and still worth keeping. Yet the writing and residue on the strip carried the stronger trail forward now. Its rubbed word had found a likely place. Its chalky line pointed toward household measuring. It had become the liveliest thread in the bundle. The papers were gathered into one neat stack once more. The paper packet of buttons, the hidden list, the return receipt, the torn scrap, and the unusual button wrapped with its strip. This time the strip was kept uppermost for easy reach. The order of the packet reflected the new order of thought, as naturally as tidying a drawer to suit the season's work. Route first, handoff second, measuring clue next. Her eyes moved from the side entrance table toward the inside, where the workbox shelf waited with scissors, chalk, and measuring tape. The glance was brief, but it held long enough to make the next step plain. If the faint line on the strip had come from ordinary sewing work, comparison there might turn a hint into something firmer than a possibility. The basket of cut flowers was finally carried the last little distance and set down where it belonged before any deeper searching began. The errand from the garden closed neatly that way, stems no longer pressing dampness into her skirt, the green scent released into the house instead of lingering half-finished at the threshold. Behind her, Silas remained near enough to follow when invited, handbill still tucked in his pocket, attention resting where the bundle of clues rested. The back way had been accounted for now. Garden gate to back door, side entrance table as likely handoff. The concealed route was no longer only a guess made over papers indoors. It had been walked, looked at, tested against wood and path and habit. As they moved inside, one small thread kept tugging more insistently than the others. The chalky line on the strip, slight as dust, waiting for the quiet company of scissors, chalk, and measuring tape. Chapter 5. A stack of recent returns moved from desk to cart beneath Mabel's hands with the neat, practiced certainty of a task done many times and still done with care. Covers brushed one another in a dry whisper, and borrowing cards clicked softly in their pockets. A cloth-bound history with a frayed spine went to the lower tier because of its weight. 2 slim travel volumes stayed together because they belonged to the same shelf range. A gardening annual, still carrying the faint green smell of damp air from wherever it had been read, was laid flat so its curled cover would not catch. Beside those small shifts of order, one thin strip remained uppermost where she had left it, never far from reach. The borrowing strip from the garden gate clues lay near the edge of the desk, aligned with the grain of the wood as carefully as if it had its own proper place among the day's work. Whenever her hands paused between one book and the next, her eye went there. The side entrance table stayed in mind as well, and the rubbed word table, both of them held in the same tidy inward row as shelf numbers and due dates and all the other things that could be trusted to wait their turn. The cart rolled out from the desk with a little wooden murmur over the floorboards. One wheel gave its familiar soft complaint near the leg of the atlas case, and then the load settled again. She guided it only a few feet before a single book checked against the rest, not by noise so much as by shape. Its height broke the line of the pile around it. Its subject, too, looked wrong at a glance, though the glance itself was the sort that came from long use rather than speed. The hand that reached for it did not snatch. A bent upper corner was smooth before the cover was opened, thumb pressing the crease flat with the same patient habit used on notices that had curled in the window and clippings that had slipped crooked in their envelopes. Order came before guessing, shelf, record, sequence. The reason for the slip could wait until the thing itself had been set straight enough to be seen. The book came free. Its boards were cool from the room and slightly rough where the cloth had worn thin at the edges. It was not one that should have been nestled among the cluster she had just lifted. The title belonged elsewhere, and in a quieter section too, one less often disturbed by a string of fresh returns. That could have meant no more than an earlier sorting hand gone astray. It happened a volume set down in haste, a card tucked into the wrong pocket, a pile begun correctly and finished while someone's mind had already gone on to another task. The cover opened, Inside, the borrowing card, edged in gold ink and worn soft at one corner, rested in its pocket, as if it had every right to be there. Yet the title, written in Mabel's own hand on that card, belonged to another volume entirely. She stood still enough for the cart's slight sway to cease. The card had the softened handling of long use, the kind that comes from years of fingers drawing it out, noting a date, easing it back again. The book holding it had no such history with that record. One had traveled, the other had merely become its shelter. Shelving stopped there, more thoroughly than if some louder interruption had crossed the room. The open book sat in her palm while she turned away from the shelves and back toward the front desk. The return cart remained where it was, half unloaded, one row of books leaning gently against the side rail. A mismatch between card and volume often came from habit or haste, but this one asked for a closer look. The card was too comfortably placed, too settled into the pocket, for a random slip made only moments before. By the time she reached the desk, the strip from before had already drawn near in thought, not because the two objects matched in appearance, but because they had both arrived by stepping sideways out of ordinary routine. The book was set down open. Light from the window spread over the page edges, pale and even, catching tiny threads in the paper where use had lifted them. The borrowing card slid free with a faint drag against the pocket. Gold ink edged the border in a line once crisp and now softened by years of contact. One corner, the lower right, had gone almost velvety under handling. The other three remained comparatively firm. She turned it over and back again, taking in the front first as any clerk would. Names, dates, the steady little procession of use. Then the latest due date held her eye. It had been written over with unusual care, not crossed out boldly and corrected in the plain way of desk work, not marked with a practical note in the margin. The newer date sat directly atop the older one, covering it so thoroughly that the first entry survived only in a faint tail beneath the ink, a shadow of a figure where the pen had once curved another way. To hide a mistake so completely took more effort than simply admitting one. The card was brought nearer the window. Under stronger light, the overwriting thickened into layers. The upper date had been laid down slowly, with a hand trying to be exact. A tiny mark sat beside it, so slight it might have escaped notice if the rest had not already drawn attention close. It was no ordinary circulation sign, only a short slanted stroke, almost the beginning of a notation and then no more. Private looking, half withheld, the sort of mark someone makes for themselves while assuming no one else will need to read it. A proper correction in library work had its own plain manners, a clean strike through the old date, a rewritten line, sometimes initials, sometimes an explanation. This had none of that. The original had been buried instead. Her thumb rested lightly over the softened corner while she studied the altered line. The card gave off a dry old paper smell with a trace of dust warmed by the room. Underneath that, there was another scent so faint it might have been imagined if it had not lingered in the fibers. Something handled, carried, kept in use. Not the stale, closed smell of a drawer left shut through seasons. The card had moved through hands and pockets and desks. It had been taken out often enough to wear one corner smooth. The question widened without becoming noisy. If the change was innocent, why conceal the earlier date at all? If the mark beside it belonged to some private reminder, why place it on a public record? She turned the card over. The reverse looked almost blank at first, only the soft roughness of cardstock and the slight yellowing of age. Then a fingertip passed across it and caught on pressure sunk into the surface. Pencil had once pressed there hard enough to leave a shallow ridge, though the words themselves had nearly gone. She shifted the card sideways. Nothing. Tipped it up. A line surfaced and vanished. Tilted again toward the window, and the angled light found the indentations more kindly. There, at the end of one line, clear enough to hold, was back. Above it, on another line, or perhaps the broken start of the same one, the opening letters Gar seemed to breathe in and out of legibility depending on how the card was held. The pencil itself had rubbed away into almost nothing. What remained could be felt more surely than read. The pressure was real. The words had been there. Their departure from the page had not erased their having been written. Her finger traced the groove without pressing hard enough to flatten it. Back, Gar. The earlier strip on the desk, with its own rubbed traces and hidden note, seemed to draw a little nearer without moving. The phrase from before, one sent back, rose into mind at once, not because this card confirmed it, but because the echo was too close to ignore. A line ending in back, another fragment beginning Gar. The garden gate had already left its narrow trail through the day's thoughts. Now a library card, tucked into the wrong book, offered a whisper from the same direction. The open book no longer mattered merely as a misplaced volume. The card no longer looked like an error, waiting to be mended and filed. A hand had written in more than one place and then half hidden what it wrote. Whether the same hand had done both things could not yet be said. The possibility sat there all the same, plain as the card itself. The parcel arrived before the voice did, announced by a folded apron scent of tea and street air that crossed the desk in a gentler way than any knock. Ivy set a small wrapped bundle at the edge of the counter and waited rather than interrupting. The paper around it was tied with string in a practical bow, and one corner had darkened where the damp outside had touched it and then dried. Street coolness came in with her, carrying a trace of stone, a trace of leaves, and the warmer note of tea that clung to cloth after a busy morning. Her first look went to the paused work, the open book in hand, the card not yet filed, the piles left midway between desk and cart. It was the sort of glance that took in process before asking after explanation. "Does that one belong with the returns?" she asked, "or with something set aside?" The question fit the moment so neatly that it seemed to rest beside the clue rather than upon it. Mabel lowered the card a little and looked from the odd volume to the other woman. "It may not belong where it was found at all," she said. Ivy did not reach across the desk. She only angled herself nearer, one hand still resting lightly on the wrapped parcel, and waited for what the work itself would reveal. That steadiness left room for the next useful thing, checking whether the wrongness spread farther than a single card. The returns on the desk were examined against their borrowing cards one by one. A poetry collection matched its proper slip. A household almanac held the right title and sequence of dates. A slim book of pressed flowers, still carrying a stray petal in the hinge, paired correctly with its own record. The cart was checked as well, the books lifted and set down in smaller groups, until every other return in the stack had proved itself ordinary. The mismatch narrowed to this one specific pairing. That narrowing mattered. General disorder could excuse almost anything. One mistaken insertion among many might be no more than a tired hand at the end of the day. Here, the surrounding order made the lone error stand up straighter. The borrowing card was brought beside the strip from the earlier clues and held toward the same patch of window light. The strip had its chalky smear, the card its rubbed pencil and overwritten date. They were not made of the same stuff and did not carry the same kind of mark. One had a dusty drag where writing had been touched and thinned. The other bore the smooth wear of repeated handling and the ghost of words pressed deep enough to survive their own fading. Yet both showed the same broad truth under the light. Neither had been written once and put away. Both had remained in use after the writing. Hands had returned to them. Fingers had smudged, checked, adjusted. The comparison did not settle anything. It linked use to use, revision to revision. A clue kept active in the world looked different from one forgotten in a drawer. These two, in their separate materials, shared that quality. Ivy leaned just enough to see without crowding the desk. Someone kept coming back to them, she said. Or to what was written on them, came the answer. The card returned to the desk, and a fingertip followed the sequence of names and dates down its face. Patterns in records had always spoken more clearly to Mabel than hunches did. Here the earlier entries formed a tidy rhythm. Returns before noon, one after another, neat in their placement and spacing. The altered line broke that rhythm. It sat later, or looked later, and the correction had been made in such a way that the original moment of return was obscured. An ordinary card from ordinary desk work should have shared the same daytime cadence as the rest. This one departed from it at the point where the hidden mark appeared. Noon, Ivy said from the other side of the desk, following the line of dates rather than the line of thought. That is when cups get left half finished at my tables. People mean to stay and then remember another errand, or they say they will come back and do not. Before noon, a thing is usually done because it was planned. After noon, there is more turning about. She did not claim the card had passed through the tea shop. The observation remained where it belonged, with habits, with timing, with the way a day changes shape around the middle. Errands undertaken early often leave fewer traces because they are built into routine. Later changes draw more eyes. The open book waited beside them, and now it took its turn under attention. Its pages were riffled gently, not in search of hidden papers, but to consider whether the subject itself made sense with the card tucked inside. It did not. The title would have had no reason to be borrowed and checked with the regularity shown by the card. The record belonged to a volume with a different kind of use, one more likely to pass through hands often enough to wear a corner soft. This book felt less like the clue's source than a temporary shelter chosen because it was close by, or because someone needed the card out of sight for a little while. That thought sent them back to the cart and the desk together. The day's returns were parted into smaller groups until the earlier arrangement could be reconstructed. One stack had stood nearest the front edge. Another had leaned against a pair of larger folios. The odd book, by memory and by the pressure marks left in the pile, must have rested among recent returns when first touched. It had not come from reference shelving. It had not drifted from a repair stack or old sorting shelf. Whatever had happened to the borrowing card, it had re-entered circulation work from someone's hand within today's routine. It made the puzzle smaller and therefore kinder to practical thought. A disturbance inside the morning's work could be traced by sequence and object. A disturbance reaching back through months of storage offered too many directions at once. The soft corner of the card called for another look. Held under the thumb and turned slowly, it showed a pattern of wear too concentrated to ignore. One corner alone had been handled far more than the others. The edge there had thinned and rounded. The gold ink nearest it had dulled. Such wear did not come from filing a card once or twice. It came from repeated partway withdrawals, the sort where a person slides a card out enough to glance at one line and then tucks it back before anyone notices they have looked. She tried the motion herself, carefully, with the card half in the pocket and then free again. The thumb naturally found that worn corner. The eye naturally landed near the altered date. The movement made sense in the hand. Someone waiting for a moment, confirming an arrangement, checking whether a date had arrived or passed, might use a card that way. Borrowing and returning a book did not ask for such repetition. Ivy watched the gesture and asked, "Do library records ever carry private reminders in the margins?" The answer took shape through the card itself. "Not in proper practice," Mabel said, "and never hidden beneath a changed date if the record is to be trusted." The line had been changed. That fact stood firmer than any theory about why. Records had their own plain dignity. Once tampered with, they asked to be read twice, for what they said and for what someone had tried to make them say instead. The reverse came back into view. The fragment at the end of the indented line back was considered against the unresolved note from before. The fit with one sent back was close enough that both women let the desk go quiet around it for a little while. A phrase about sending something back had previously hovered near sewing stock and possibility, because that was one easy way to hear such words. Here, on a borrowing card, return belonged to records and routines instead. A thing sent back could be a book, a card, a decision, an instruction moved through ordinary places where no one would think to question it. The clue did not prove itself by echo. Still, the echo shifted the path beneath their feet. If someone had used public systems to carry private sorting, the hidden notes would not need to be dramatic. They would only need to look dull enough to pass. The half-seen Gar was treated with more restraint. She set the card beside the earlier strip and looked from one to the other without forcing the fragment into certainty. Both might point toward the garden gate. Both might only seem to. The repeated habit of naming things halfway mattered more than the exact word. One concealed phrase could be accident. Two, each withholding itself in a slightly different way, suggested method. The cart still waited to be shelved, and work could not stay suspended forever without becoming less useful. It was put back into motion one shelf at a time. Books that had proved themselves ordinary returned to their places in the stacks. The odd volume remained on the desk, separate and open no longer, but not restored to order before its record had earned that restoration. For now, it did not belong with the others. When the last proper return had been slid into place and the cart stood lighter by several rows, Mabel brought forward the borrowing desk ledger. Its weight came into her hands with familiar authority. Boards firm, pages thick enough to hold ink without feathering. This was the book meant to settle disputes, to answer memory with record. She opened it to the date suggested by the altered line on the card, trusting the ledger before any story they might be tempted to make from fragments. The pages gave off a denser paper scent than the loose card had done. Inked entries marched across them in orderly rows. Here was the clean version, if one remained. The line before alteration, the official trace before private interference. While she searched, Ivy stayed nearby without hovering. The wrapped parcel still sat where it had been placed, forgotten for the moment. One hand rested on the desk edge. The other smoothed the string once and left it alone. Her usefulness had already shown itself in habits and timing, in the way noon divided one kind of movement from another. The ledger itself belonged to Mabel's world. The line appeared. Its answer was plain enough once found. The date on the borrowing card had been changed after the ledger had already been written, not the other way around. In the ledger, the original entry sat in steady ink, made with the confidence of routine. Beside it, a later nib had returned to thicken one word and crowd a second mark into the margin. The difference in pressure could be seen. The spacing gave it away as well. The first hand had written with room to spare. The later revision squeezed itself into a place not meant for it. Someone had revised the public record after the fact. That did not name who. It did not explain whether the altered date served concealment, convenience, or instruction. It did something more useful for the moment. It changed the shape of the problem. This was no longer a book shelved wrongly with another's card tucked inside. It was tampered record-keeping, carried out carefully enough to hide an earlier line and clumsily enough to leave traces in both card and ledger. The borrowing card, edged in gold ink and worn soft at one corner, was laid across the open ledger, so the altered line and the altered date faced one another in plain view. Card above, ledger below. Private revision over public entry. The odd book set aside. The cart emptied into proper shelves. The strip from the earlier clue still near at hand. Paper met paper in the hush of the desk, and the question before them had become cleaner than it had been an hour ago. Ivy looked from the ledger to the card. That is more than a muddled return. It is, Mabel said. A brief silence followed, occupied by pages, by the faint street sound beyond the window, by the little settling creak old desks make when a ledger is opened wide. Then she turned to the other woman with a practical request shaped to fit the help she could actually give. If anyone mentions a before-noon meeting over tea, she said, or speaks casually of having sent something back, I would be glad to hear it. I can keep an ear for that. Thank you. Whatever came next belonged less to town chatter than to the hands responsible for desk entries. That decision did not need speaking aloud to become firm. It lay there in the open ledger as clearly as the altered ink. For a little while longer, the two pieces stayed where they were, one across the other. The card's softened corner pointed toward the margin mark below. The overwritten date hovered above the steadier line it had tried to replace. Around them, the front desk settled back into its paper-soft hush. The next step waited calmly on the page. Chapter 6. Ribbon whispered over paper in the chairside light, drawn snug around one small bundle of letters and crossed under itself with the neatness of a habit practiced many evenings over. The stack had already been squared once against Mabel's palm, yet she tapped the lower edges again, listening to the soft click of page against page before settling it into the willow basket of keepsakes at her feet. The basket gave back a dry, woven scent warmed by the lamp, the smell of old reeds and older paper, with the faint sweetness that clings to pages kept long past their practical use. Another little pile waited on her lap, loosened from a larger gathering and arranged by date. Saved notes rested beneath one ribbon. A folded handkerchief had drifted down near the chair leg and stayed there, forgotten for the moment. The corner looked lived in rather than arranged for company. It held the signs of an evening put to use. Paper edges aligned, ribbons unrolled and wound again, categories made and remade with the patience of someone who trusted that order, if attended to closely enough, could settle many things into place. One bundle, newly tied, was drawn back at once. The knot was eased apart with careful fingers, not because the ribbon had been badly done, but because two dates on the top letters wanted one more look. Their corners were lifted, the pages shifted against each other with a papery hush. The dates were checked and set in sequence again. Then the ribbon went around them once more, tied with the same even pull. It was the sort of movement that belonged equally to this chair and to the library desk, where an overwritten date and a revised ledger entry had stayed in her mind all through the walk home. Sequence mattered. Pressure of pen mattered. A little mark in a margin could matter more than the line it sat beside. A drift of sorted paper slid aside when she reached for another ribbon, and there, where no letter case or keepsake envelope ought to have been, lay the sewing needle case lined with blue felt. It had no business among saved correspondence. Mending belonged to the basket by the chair, to hems and cuffs and the practical work of evening hands. Keepsakes belonged to the willow basket. The case rested half under a thin sheaf of notes, as though one kind of tidying had crossed into another and been interrupted before the mistake could be corrected. Its clasp, usually shut with a tidy little click, sat not quite fastened. The case was lifted from the papers and turned in the light. Blue felt showed for an instant at the edge where the clasp had not fully met. The outside was familiar enough to the touch that the wrongness of its place grew sharper by contrast. Her thumb found the seam, then the clasp. Before opening it, she weighed it once in her hand, a small domestic measure so ordinary it hardly felt like inquiry. Something in it leaned to one side. Needles had their own slightness. Thread, wound, and tucked had another. This felt different, not heavy enough to suggest any proper tool had been added by mistake. Only a minute imbalance, the sort one notices because one knows an object well enough to feel when it has changed. It called up the same inward pause that had come at the library desk when the borrowing card had shown one pressure of writing beneath another, and when the margin mark beside the altered date had seemed too deliberate for a stray motion of the pen. The clasp opened. Blue felt, worn smooth in a few familiar places, lined the inside. A needle glinted where it belonged. A little loop of thread lay caught beneath one flap. Flat against the felt, tucked so closely into the lining that it had nearly become part of the case itself, rested a narrow paper slip. It was drawn out carefully because the paper had been folded to fit the length of the case and had taken on a slight curve from its hiding place. The first thing visible was ink. The second was repetition. One line read, in a hand small enough to suggest economy rather than flourish, sent back before noon. Beneath it, the same words appeared again. The second version sat more tightly in the middle, the spacing crowded, as though the phrase had been copied from memory after the first attempt, or fitted into a narrower understanding of the line than the writer had begun with. The letters did not wander. They pressed inward. And beside that second line, almost tucked into the margin of itself, was a tiny slanted stroke. Her hand stilled over the paper. The mark was very small. It might have passed under a quicker eye as a slip of the pen, a decorative finish, a scratch made while lifting away. Seen here, with the lamp close and the paper held nearly level, It looked intentional in the way some habits of handwriting do. Private, unannounced, and repeated because the hand knows its own path. The borrowing card from the library had borne the same kind of slant beside the overwritten date. There, too, it had been too slight to explain itself and too exact to dismiss. The slip was lowered to her lap and lifted again, this time by the corners, so the light could move across the ink. The first line appeared steadier. The second compressed itself in the middle where the phrase narrowed. If the words had been copied twice, why twice? To preserve them? To practice them? To make sure they were right before being used elsewhere? No answer settled at once. The little stroke by the lower line kept drawing the eye back. A faint ridge in the fold suggested there was more within. The paper was opened another degree, and from inside it slipped a much smaller fragment, torn rather than cut. A corner no bigger than a thumbnail, penciled with only one broken beginning. Gar. The letters were blunted by pressure. Whoever had written them had not sharpened the pencil for clarity or ornament. The line dragged slightly in the paper's grain, making the word beginning look pressed out rather than written cleanly on top. She turned the scrap over and back again, then held it beside the larger slip. The unfinished syllable offered too many possibilities and completed none of them. Garden. Garment, garnet, garnet, garnet. None sat honestly in the space. What troubled her was the pencil itself. On the hidden borrowing card from earlier, the reverse side had carried an indented style of pencil note, faint but present under the fingers, and visible where the light struck low across the surface. This fragment bore a similar pressure, the same sense of a hand writing through the paper rather than skimming over it. Not enough to prove anything by itself, enough to make coincidence sit less comfortably. The little scrap was set on the chair arm while the larger slip was unfolded fully. Its reverse showed 3 short columns of dates, written in a compact arrangement that suggested record rather than musing. One date sat at the top of the first column. Another stood below and to the side. Between 2 filled entries, one place had been left blank. It was not a broad blank, not a forgotten page or a line skipped by inattention. It was a space of the same family as the entries around it, held open where a date might have gone and did not. The eye traveled from one written date to the next and stumbled there. She looked again, this time with the memory of the library ledger near at hand in her mind. One of these dates aligned with the day the public record had been revised. The fit was close enough to sharpen the paper in her fingers. A private system. The thought came in pieces. A hidden borrowing card, an altered line in the ledger, a tiny slanted mark, this copied phrase, these dates without labels. Public records lived by clarity. They were meant to be found, read, trusted. This slip had been folded into a sewing needle case lined with blue felt and tucked among letters. It had been kept near ordinary household things, hidden by familiarity rather than by locks. If it tracked library handling at all, it did so in parallel, under the public work and close beside it. The paper was laid flat on the chair seat. One fingertip touched the blank place between the dates and then moved away. There was no use forcing an answer too quickly. The first work was to see what was there and to see it cleanly. Outside the room, a floorboard gave a mild note from the stair. A thread of cooler air followed before Silas appeared, carrying the outdoors in the folds of his coat. A postcard showed from one pocket, its corner pale in the lamplight. Under his arm rested a small packet of paper souvenirs, gathered in the loose but careful way of someone who had come home with the day still partly unsorted. He did not cross straight to the chair. At the edge of the light, he paused, taking in the shifted bundles, the opened sewing needle case lined with blue felt, and the narrow slip spread where letters had been. "What has interrupted the evening?" he asked. Instead of answering at once, she held the paper out across the lamplight. Silas set his own papers down without mixing them into the chairside order. He took the slip by its edges and read as though it were a handbill brought in from the street after a performance, worth studying for what had been repeated and where the writer had failed to copy cleanly. His gaze moved over the first line, then the second. It settled there. "The middle tightens," he said quietly, as if the phrase was already known and had to be fitted back in. The sewing corner began to change under their hands. Ribbon-tied bundles were shifted aside one by one, each moved with enough care that no old order was spoiled more than necessary. A clear patch of floor appeared between chair and basket. The chair seat itself became a working surface. The larger slip was placed in the center. Beside it went the torn gar fragment. A few saved notes with blank backs were drawn near, not as keepsakes now, but as useful paper. The mending basket corner, with its folded handkerchief and aligned stacks, turned into a small records table assembled from whatever the evening had already provided. The first matter between them was the tiny, slanted stroke. Memory had to serve where the borrowing card itself was not present, yet memory had enough shape to be useful. She described the mark beside the overwritten date, its angle, its size, the way it sat too close to the line to be decorative and too far from the numerals to be part of them. Silas bent over the slip and looked at the mark here in the same spirit, with no haste to declare it solved. The pen line leaned slightly forward, a private check made by a hand accustomed to making it for itself. "If one saw this by itself," he said, "it could be dismissed. But beside your card?" She nodded. Pattern did the work quietly. A person may vary a word from one day to the next, may press harder or lighter depending on the pen, may even alter a date in a hurry. Habit often survives such changes. Tiny slant made after a line is finished, repeated where no public instruction calls for it, belongs more deeply to the writer than the larger text does. They sat with that thought long enough for it to settle into shape. The hidden borrowing card and this tucked away slip had almost certainly been touched by the same person, or else by someone who had studied that person's hand closely enough to imitate one of its least necessary motions. The conclusion rested there, modest and firm. One of the saved notes was turned over to its blank back. the front, whatever old message it carried, face down. A pencil was found. She copied the 3 dates from the slip into a cleaner line, leaving the same measured space where the original had left 1 date absent. The rewritten version looked plainer at once, freed from folds and cramped margins. Once the distraction of torn paper and hidden storage fell away, the omission grew larger. An orderly sequence had been broken on purpose. She looked from the copied dates to the original and back again. A careless hand usually leaves signs of carelessness elsewhere. A slanting line, a changed spacing, a date half formed. Here the entries kept their composure. The blank place had edges because the surrounding dates gave it edges. It belonged to the system as surely as the written ones did. Silas touched the copied row lightly with 1 finger. That gap matters as much as an entry, he said. The phrase from the front of the slip lay waiting beside them. When it was spoken aloud, it was done only once and softly, with the practical weight of words meant to pass between people who already knew what they were for. In the room, separated from whatever original errand had once carried it, the line sounded less like conversation than instruction. A thing to be done, a thing to be understood without asking more. People on the road use that sort of language, he said, still looking at the paper rather than at her. Performers, travelers, anyone needing to move private matters through public places, harmless enough if overheard. Library circulation would do the same, she said. Books come and go all day. Cards are handled, dates entered, returns expected. Phrase like that could pass through ordinary work without anyone pausing over it. The thought widened the room's little arrangement of papers. Public systems are trusted because they are ordinary. A ledger can hide a great deal under plain ink if everyone assumes the line means only what it says. The torn fragment with "gar" on it was brought closer to 1 bundle of saved letters, though only for a brief trial. A few household words from old notes were tested against it by eye and then set aside. Nothing among her own papers fit cleanly. No familiar phrase from mending, shopping, or domestic messages wanted to complete itself honestly from those 3 letters and the trailing pause. The fragment remained stubbornly itself. Yet even that refusal narrowed the field. It did not belong with private keepsakes. It belonged with copied fragments and hidden records. The pencil drag was considered again. Silas held the scrap at an angle so the lamp could catch the depressions. The marks looked pressed in, the way writing does when the hand leans hard or the paper rests on something yielding. She remembered the back of the borrowing card and how the faint pencil there had seemed impressed into the surface more than written upon it. If one person had copied from another source, or copied from memory after seeing a source briefly, pressure might remain where precision failed. Gar could be the beginning of something important enough to preserve and incomplete enough to hide. Their attention returned to the blank date. Omissions can be safer than entries, he said. In any system meant to pass unnoticed, what is missing may tell the real story. That sat at once with her own habits. A librarian knows that a book absent from the shelf can speak as clearly as one in hand, provided the record around it is sound. If one date had been intentionally left open in this private sequence, perhaps it marked the item that had been sent back in some manner other than ordinary borrowing. The public ledger might later need revising because the visible path of the item had to be brought into line with the hidden one. A return entered after the fact, a borrowing card altered to suit what had already been privately arranged. The idea did not close the matter. It gave the clues a direction in which they could stand together. The sewing needle case, lined with blue felt, was examined again, though now for its use rather than its contents. It lay open on the chair arm, emptied of the slip, but still holding the shape of concealment. Why choose this? Why not leave the note among letters, where paper already belonged? The answer sat in the room itself. Mending things are looked for when mending is to be done. Letters are sorted, reread, moved. A paper hidden in a library record would invite scrutiny from anyone using that record. A paper tucked into a domestic case among ribbons and thread could sit for days in plain household disorder, overlooked because it was exactly where no one expected records to be. Blue felt softened the inside, muting any rustle. The clasp, if nearly shut, gave little sign. It was concealment without drama, the kind made by someone who understood rooms and habits better than locks. Memory of the front desk began to reorder everything on the chair seat. The overwritten date on the borrowing card no longer stood alone as a blemish. The revised ledger entry with its different pressure no longer looked merely untidy. The added margin mark had company now in the slanted stroke on the slip. Here was a privately kept copy. Here were dates in sequence, with one omitted. Here was a phrase practical enough to move unnoticed through ordinary circulation work. Piece by piece, the pattern gathered itself. It pointed towards someone using desk records as cover for a separate chain of messages. Neither of them hurried beyond that. The room did not ask for haste. It asked for preservation. She gathered the slip, the torn gar fragment, and the copied dates on the blank-backed note into one small packet. A ribbon was chosen and passed around them once, then again, tied with a knot secure enough to keep one clue from wandering away from the others in the night. The bundle was set apart from the ordinary saved letters, close enough to hand that it would not be lost among keepsakes, and not so hidden that morning might have to search for it. The practical understanding between them had become plain. The hidden borrowing card was not the only private copy in circulation. The line about being sent back before noon belonged to a repeated system, something used and preserved, not a single stray remark caught by chance. The unresolved gar remained unresolved, though it no longer floated free. It now rested among copied fragments, omitted dates, and altered public records held in one place where further thought could meet it. Around the cleared patch of floor, the ordinary letters began to go back into the willow basket of keepsakes. Each ribbon-tied bundle returned to its place, with the mild firmness of household order resuming where it could. The clue bundle did not join them. It stayed apart within easy reach, acknowledged by its separation. The sewing needle case lined with blue felt still lay open. She lifted it once more and checked the little loops and pockets inside. Needles remained where they should. Thread was returned to its proper place. The hidden papers were gone. One fingertip smoothed the felt where the slip had rested flat against the lining, pressing out the slightest memory of its curve. Then the case was closed, this time with the clasp fully shut and set aside for actual mending. Across the room, the sewing table by the lamplit window waited with a folded pattern resting on it. Something still lay beneath that pattern, enough to draw the eye in passing, though the moment did not turn into another search. The table offered a better use than that. It was a place chosen for careful work, visible and orderly. She crossed with the ribbon-bound clue bundle in hand, while Silas gathered his postcard and packet of paper souvenirs from the edge of the chair light. At the table, the folded pattern was lifted only enough to make room. The clue bundle was placed beneath it, not buried, only kept together under a plain domestic weight until morning. Paper answered paper. What had been misplaced among keepsakes was now deliberately archived in a space meant for measured hands and patient attention. Silas left the corner as lightly as he had entered it, carrying his own unsorted scraps with him. No promise needed saying over the lamplight. The arrangement on the sewing table said enough. So did the cleared chair side and the separate ribbon around the clues. Back by the basket, one last loose ribbon was wound into a tidy circle and laid on top of the willow weave. The folded handkerchief was lifted from beside the chair leg and set where it belonged. The room settled around the small corrections, lamp warming the edge of a skirt, basket reeds holding their dry scent, paper resting in stacks that no longer had to explain themselves for the night. Only one purposeful change remained in the corner, and it was elsewhere now, waiting beneath the folded pattern by the window. And that is where our story rests for today. Thank you for listening and for spending this quiet time with Cozy Tales. Until next time, rest well.